They say life in the small village of Makoma was always the same, slow, simple, and predictable. But even in the most ordinary places, a single act of kindness can plant a seed that grows far beyond what anyone imagines. In that quiet fishing village, everyone knew Bantao. He was the old man who always came back from the river with fresh tilapia, a man whose hands smelled of salt water and smoke from the firewood he used to grill his catch. People admired his fish, but not many paid attention to his loneliness. His house by the river was always silent, the only sound being the crackling of embers or the creak of his wooden bench. No one knocked on his door. No one asked about his days. He was respected, but he was also alone. That silence was broken one afternoon when a thin, ragged boy appeared on his doorstep. The boy didn't ask for food, didn't explain himself. He simply stood there, his eyes heavy with hunger. Without a word, Bantao slid his plate across, offering him part of his meal. The boy ate quickly, then disappeared without saying a single thing. But the next day, and the day after, the boy returned. Each time he ate in silence and left again. It became a strange routine between them. No questions, no names, no stories shared, only the quiet bond of food and survival. Then one day, the boy finally whispered, "Thank you." And just like that, he vanished. He never came back. Touchy. Old Fisherman's act of kindness seemed to dissolve into nothing, like footprints washed away by the tide. But years later, a shining car rolled into the dusty village road, stopping where no such car had ever been before. The villagers crowded, whispering, pointing, wondering. From it stepped a wealthy man, dressed in clothes that spoke of a life far from Makoma. He asked for Bantao by name. In his hand, he carried a small dried fish, kept like a treasure, like a memory too sacred to lose. And with that fish, he carried a story that would show everyone the true weight of that single meal shared long ago. But before that day, before the return of the past, there had been years of waiting. After the boy's disappearance, life in Makoma slipped back into its quiet rhythm. But Bantao's world was never quite the same. The river still carried its lazy waves, the winds of Langal still swept through the fields, but in the old fisherman's home, silence had taken on a heavier meaning. The wooden bench outside seemed emptier. The ember still glowed every afternoon, the fish still grilled, and yet there was always an extra plate served. Bantao never spoke about it, and no one dared to question him. The boy's absence hadn't erased his presence. It had carved it deeper, leaving an invisible shadow that lingered. Day after day, the routine continued. An extra plate, a full serving set aside as though the boy might appear at any moment. When he didn't, Bantao quietly took the plate, crumbs and all, down to the riverbank and washed it with a kind of reverence, as if the act itself was a prayer. To the villagers, it became something strange, even foolish. "Bantao's losing. His mind," some whispered at the market, laughing with their mouths full of cassava. Feeding the wind, others mocked near the well, snickering at the idea of setting a plate for someone who was long gone. But no matter the laughter, Bantao never faltered. His answer was always the same, spoken with calm certainty. "Those who have fish and don't share it rot with guilt." To him, feeding the boy had never been just charity. It was something deeper, a promise, a pact between two souls who had met in hunger and silence. As time went on, his persistence began to shift the air in Makoma. Some neighbors, once mocking, started leaving small gifts at his door, a pinch of salt, a gourd of palm oil, a handful of beans. They never spoke about it, but their quiet gestures showed that something in Bantao's ritual touched them. Even the children grew curious. One little boy once asked him, "Uncle, why do you always cook for two when you live alone?" Bantao turned the fish slowly on the fire, his hands gentle, his eyes thoughtful. before answering softly, "Because some hungers never go away, and some memories feed more than food." The boy didn't fully understand, but he remembered those words. In time, the villagers stopped mocking and started respecting. They slowed their steps when passing his house, sometimes leaving small offerings in the night. Because even if they couldn't explain it, they sensed that Bantao wasn't just feeding an empty chair. He was feeding memory. He was keeping kindness alive. But no matter how much the village slowly came to accept, the ache of absence never left Bantao. He carried it like the river carried silt, quiet, heavy, unshakable. And though he never said it aloud, everyone who looked into his tired eyes could see it. They could see the longing, the sorrow, and the hope that refused to die. It was on one of those long afternoons, with the river dragging along fallen leaves and the sky heavy with heat, that something shifted. Bantao had prepared the plates as always, his with the smaller fish, the other with the best piece, more flour, a drizzle of palm oil. He set it on the table, waiting. The boy appeared just as silently as always, but this time his eyes carried something different. He lingered, hesitated, then finally spoke those words that had waited for so long. "Thank you, sir." And with that, the boy disappeared from his life forever. The old fisherman, though his heart ached, never let the ritual die. He kept setting that extra plate, kept waiting in silence, even when the boy never returned. Because some gestures, once born, become part of who you are. Some kindnesses are too powerful to fade, even in the face of absence. And one of them was Bantu's quiet hope. The hope that wherever that boy might be, he remembered the taste of fish, of flour, of rain on tin, and the gaze of an old man who never asked his name, but knew how to recognize hunger. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere out in the world, that boy was also waiting for the right moment to return. Time has a cruel way of passing when you're waiting for something that never returns. And in Makoma, the years came slowly, but with weight. The waters of the Lungale no longer brought as many fish, and the winds had shifted direction. It was as if even nature had begun to forget the generosity it once offered the old fisherman. Bantao was no longer the same. His hair, once thin and gray, was now completely white, as if longing itself had blown mist over his head. His hands, once strong enough to pull in nets, now trembled slightly as he tied the fishing lines. The boat, his companion of decades, creaked, its wood groaning like tired bones. Each trip to the river became a challenge, and each return a lament. The fish seemed to hide, or perhaps it was exhaustion that drove them away. Bantao's body could no longer endure long hours in the canoe. The strength in his legs faded, and rheumatism began to bite at his knees, especially on damp early mornings. "Even so," he persisted. He kept going to the riverbank even if he came back with his basket nearly empty. Dot in the village, the changes, were plain to see. The younger ones started drifting away from fishing, seeking other trades. The village was growing in a direction Bantao no longer recognized. The homes, once made of mud and straw, now had cement and iron bars. The market, once a space for bartering and conversation, had turned into a battlefield of prices and humiliations, disguised as business. The old fisherman felt the world was changing, and he was being left behind. No one stopped at his door anymore. Those who had once left sacks of flour or jars of salt out of respect for the old ritual now walked past in a hurry. Some no longer recognized him. Others preferred to forget. Because to respect someone else's pain requires facing your own indifference, and not everyone can do that. Bantao's house grew quieter. The roof still creaked in the rain, but there was no one to hear it. The dishes were still washed, but rarely served with abundance. At times, he would spend the entire day eating only boiled cassava because the fish he managed to sell at the market wasn't enough to buy much else. He didn't complain, never voiced a single word of grievance, but the sadness was clear in the way. He closed the door at dusk slowly, like someone who didn't want to say goodbye, but already knew he was being left behind. What hurt Bantu the most wasn't the poverty or the hunger or the fatigue. It was the loneliness. It was the fact that no one seemed to notice his existence anymore. It was as if he was slowly disappearing, not like a body that dies, but like a memory that fades. And there was another pain, one he never confessed to anyone, the boy's absence. The silence of that "thank you, sir," that echoed in his head like a broken song. He often asked himself before falling asleep whether the boy had died or simply gone down another path. But what hurt most was imagining he'd been forgotten, as if all of it, the gesture, the sharing, had been just a brief pause in a bigger story that no longer included the old fisherman. Still, Bantu endured every day. He tied on his straw hat, grabbed his fishing rod, and went to the river. Even if he came back empty-handed, even if no one was waiting anymore, because there was a strength inside him that came from somewhere else. A strength that didn't rely on reward. It was as if he fished not for the fish, but for the memory, for the belief that goodness, even when forgotten, doesn't cease to be good. And it was during this time when life seemed to be drying up like the Lungalspanksat, the end of the dry season, that fate began to stir once more, still invisible, still silent, but fate-like. Deep waters sometimes keeps its best surprises. For when hope is nearly turned to forgetting, on the hardest days, when even the fish seem to hide their scaly bodies from Bantu's hook, the old fisherman began to look more often at the bottom drawer of his wooden cabinet. There, among old rags, a used candle, and a copper medal that had once belonged to his mother, was a carefully folded piece of paper, a letter written in shaky handwriting, but filled with hope. Bantu had written that letter 2 years earlier. It wasn't long, just a few lines asking for help from a distant cousin who, according to what people said, had made a better life in a neighboring town. He didn't ask for much, just a bit of support to fix his boat, maybe buy a new net or perhaps some flour and soap. But it had been a hard letter to write because for someone who had spent a lifetime giving, asking felt like swallowing one's own dry pride, like eating raw fish. He remembered the day he wrote it. It was raining. He was shaking from the cold and from shame. But hunger that month had been harsher than pride, so he sat in his straw chair, lit a candle, and wrote, "My cousin, this is Bantu Weimer's son. Life has been hard. I need help, if you can." He folded the paper with tired hands, walked to the village's small post station, handed it to the clerk, a young woman who barely looked him in the eyes, and returned home with a tight heart. But a thread of hope. He waited for weeks, then months. Every time someone passed by on a bicycle along the dirt road, he turned his head. Every sound of footsteps was a possibility. Every visit to the market, an anxious glance toward the road. But the reply never came. Dot. At first, he thought maybe the cousin had fallen ill. Later, that he might be traveling. Eventually, he began to believe the cousin had simply ignored the request. The pain of being forgotten hurt more than the lack of a response. But what Bantu didn't know and never would was that the letter had been lost along the way. It never reached its destination. The rain swallowed it. Or perhaps it was the carelessness of some postal worker. It didn't matter. The request dissolved in time like everything too fragile to survive. Without an answer, the days grew shorter and the nights longer. Debts began to knock at the door, small ones but constant. A sack of salt left unpaid, a bar of soap jotted down. In a shopkeeper's notebook, a ladle of oil borrowed and never returned. Tiny things, but together they built a tall wall between Bantu and peace. The house aunts, scented with ember, fish, and wind, now smelled of dampness, mold, and discouragement. The oil lamp burned dimmer. The clay stove creaked. Even the frogs croaking at night seemed sadder. At the bottom of the drawer, Bantao kept a copy of the letter. He reread it from time to time. Like someone rereads an unanswered prayer, he never threw it away, never tore it up, never rewrote it. He simply kept it. Like someone who keeps the memory of a dream that almost was a piece of faith that, though wilted, still pulsed. One day he even began writing a new letter, but he didn't finish it. The pen stopped working halfway through a sentence, and he took it as a sign. Sometimes the silence of the world speaks louder than any written word. And so he carried on with the copy of the letter tucked away and his head lowered. His feet ached, his hands bled. But there was something inside Bantao that refused to give up completely. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe faith, or maybe it was that kind of dignity that doesn't need to be recognized, only upheld. The village noticed. He was aging. But as often happens with those who grow old in silence, few asked. Some felt pity, but didn't know what to say. Others preferred to look away as if another's suffering were contagious. And, of course, there were those who mocked. There always are. But Bantu never let anyone see all of his pain. He still fished, even if with no return. He still swept his doorstep, still nodded in greeting, still offered a calabash of water to pass. Respect, because respect for others was what sustained his own self-respect. And the letter forgotten in a drawer became a symbol of something greater. It was no longer just a plea. It was the memory that once he had the courage to say, "I need help." And that for someone like Bantao was almost a miracle. But fate, like lost letters, also likes to follow its own paths. And sometimes, when everything seems lost, it begins to write a reply. Even when we no longer know, we're still being heard. Makoma was a small village, but the market was its beating heart. Every Wednesday, early in the morning, the women came with baskets on their heads. The men pushed makeshift carts, and the elders gathered in the corners to trade stories, goods, and gossip. It was there that the smell of fish mixed with roasted flour, green mango, and the week's rumors. Banto, even with his body more bent and his calloused hands, still made a point to show up at the market, not out of pride, but because deep down selling 3 or 4 fish was what earned him a bit of kerosene for the oil lamp, a spoon of cooking oil, a handful of beans, and also because despite everything, he still believed that respect was earned through consistency, not pity. That day Bantao arrived early. He brought 3 small tilapias caught with great effort in the shallow banks of the El Gale. His woven basket was worn but clean, the fish neatly arranged on fresh leaves. The old man walked slowly to the corner where he usually sat near the shade of the jamblin tree where the older folks gathered. He laid the cloth on the ground, carefully placed the fish, and waited. But Makoma's market was no longer the same. In recent months, a new merchant had arrived. A tall, strong man with a fast tongue and a smile that only appeared when convenient. His name was Ensako. He said he'd come from the big city to teach these country folks how real business is done. He opened a modern stall with a digital scale, frozen, fish, and even a small stand with a blue tarp. At first, the village was skeptical. But the low prices and loud voice eventually drew in the customers, and with them came disdain, mockery, and a kind of arrogance that suffocated those who still tried to live off the little they knew how to do. That morning, Enseo looked at Bantao with contempt. He saw the old man setting up his basket in the corner and made a point of climbing onto a wooden crate so everyone could hear him. "Folks, come see! Today we've got real fresh fish, not those dry bones from colonial times," he shouted, laughing loudly. Some laughed out of politeness. Others lowered their eyes. Bantu pretended it wasn't about him. He remained seated, motionless, like someone who's learned to resist ridicule with the same dignity they resist hunger. But Eno wasn't finished. He walked over to the old man, pointed at his fish, and said loudly, "Old man, go eat your bones." No one would take that, even for free. Time to hang up the nets, huh? A strange silence spread through the place. For a second, the laughter stopped. The scene was too cruel, even for the most insensitive. Bantao slowly raised his eyes. It said nothing. He simply looked at Eno with the same expression one gives a stone in the middle of the road, acknowledging the obstacle, but not hating it. With trembling hands, he gathered his fish back into the basket, tied up the cloth, stood up with difficulty, and walked slowly toward the market's exit. No one stopped him. No one helped. And what hurt most wasn't the humiliation. It was the silence of those who watched. On the way home, Bantao didn't cry, but his steps dragged more than ever. Dignity weighed heavier than the empty basket. He knew that in that moment, something inside him had broken. It wasn't pride. It was the belief that respect could withstand time. It was the certainty that even with little, there was still room for what was right. When he arrived home, he didn't light the embers. He didn't prepare fish. He just sat on the porch, the basket still in his lap, and stared at the horizon like someone searching for answers that never come. Dot. In the village, the story spread like fire through dry grass. Some laughed again, others fell silent out of shame. And there were those who said Bantu had it coming. Why didn't he just retire already? But among the older ones, those who knew the value of a life built on effort and silence, something deeper began to grow, discomfort, because old Bantao, with his slow gestures and soft voice, was more than a fisherman. He was a symbol, and that day the symbol had been trampled in front of everyone and no one did anything but fate. That old storyteller tends to have a good memory, and it does not forget those who give without asking, those who feed without demanding, those who are humiliated in public squares, yet continue walking with their heads held high even if they're falling apart inside. That day, Bantu didn't sell any fish, but without knowing it, he began stitching the thread of a new story, a story still hidden in the folds of time, but one that was coming, and it would come with force. Mornings in Makoma had their own rhythm. The rooster crowed early, doors creaked slowly, and the smell of corn porridge rose from clay kitchens even before the sun touched the tops of the mango trees. The village moved through its cycle almost without surprises, almost without hurry. That's why, on that particular day, the dust kicked up by a black pickup truck stirred so much curiosity. The engine roared like a beast down the dirt road, startling chickens, dogs, and whispered conversations. It wasn't common. It wasn't expected. A truck that big, with dark windows and shiny wheels, looked like something from another world. In Makoma, cars were rare and nice ones. Even rarer. People came out of their homes with hands still wet with soap, eyes squinting against the sun. The truck stopped right in the middle of the village in front of the old fig tree where children tossed stones in the late afternoon. The door opened slowly, revealing a man of medium height, well-dressed, wearing dark sunglasses, with a presence that silenced more than it said. No one recognized him at first. He carried a small briefcase in one hand and a curious glass jar in the other. Inside the jar was something odd. A dried fish, very small, wrapped in cotton, as if it were a relic, and in a way, it was. The man walked over to the stall of the village's oldest vendor and asked in a firm voice, "Ma'am, could you tell me where the fisherman named Bantao lives?" She furrowed her brow. That question, in that tone, felt heavy, with something old. "He lives just past the bamboo grove, the clay house with the blue window." "But why?" The man simply lifted the jar with the dried fish and said, "This saved me once. Now I've come to return the favor." The news spread in seconds, as always happens, in small villages. Someone told someone else, who ran and whispered it to another, and so before the man reached Bantao's house, everyone already knew someone important, or at least different, was looking for him. The door to the old man's house was ajar. The embers from the previous night still slept in the clay stove. Bantow sat on the same bench as always, mending an old net with makeshift thread, his eyes tired, his face worn. It was a day like any other until the man's shadow stretched across the dirt floor. Dobantu slowly lifted his eyes. He saw the expensive shoes first, then the clean trousers, and only then the face. The man took off his sunglasses. "You might not remember me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Banto looked more closely. Time erases features but not gestures. And there, in the middle of that grown-up face, hidden between the wrinkles of fate, was a gaze. That same gaze from years ago, standing under the mango tree, hungry and silent. The old man said nothing, but something inside his chest stirred as if the past had come knocking, dressed in new clothes. The man knelt down, opened his briefcase, and pulled out the jar with the dried fish. He handed it to the old man with trembling hands. This was the first real meal I ever had. I kept it, not because it was fish, but because it was life. You fed me when I didn't even know if I mattered. Today I came back to feed you. Banto still didn't speak. His eyes were brimming with tears. His hands gripped the jar like someone holding a piece of their own heart in the village. No one fully understood what was happening, but everyone saw it. The truck, the well-dressed man, the old fisherman with full eyes and a dried fish relic of a silent gesture. The man stood up, took a deep breath, and sighed us, if declaring a promise to himself. I took too long, but I didn't forget. And in that moment, under the tennis sun, with the dust still dancing in the air in the eyes of the village, fixed on that clay house, something changed. It wasn't just the return of a lost boy. It was the return of memory, of dignity, of a kindness that even when forgotten never truly dies. Because there are gestures time can't erase. There are memories that become destiny. And there are reunions that don't need explanation, only silence. Silence and a dried fish kept like a miracle. The village of Makoma, so used to its simple and predictable days, had never witnessed a scene like that. A well-dressed man in a crisp suit and with an emotional gaze, kneeling before an old fisherman in worn-out sandals and calloused hands. It was like watching two worlds touch, not through words, but through something deeper. Something most people there didn't even know how to name. Banto held the small jar with thaw-dried fish in his hands as if holding a living memory. His fingers trembled, not from weakness, but from emotion, from recognition, from a kind of gratitude that doesn't speak. It only exists. And in that moment, even without understanding everything, he knew that man kneeling in front of him was the boy. The same boy who had stood silently beneath the mango tree, who had eaten in silence, who had said thank you with his eyes. The silence between them lasted exactly as long as the heart needed to remember. When the man finally stood up, his eyes were red, but he wasn't ashamed. He looked at Bantow with strength and said, "Today I own a company. I have a house, children, a wife. But if I'm alive, it's because you shared with me the little you had without ever asking who I was, without ever charging me. You gave me food, but what I received was more than that. You gave me a place in the world." Bantow took a deep breath, tried to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, he slowly stood up, leaning on the door frame, and pointed to the wooden bench, the same bench where the boy used to eat. The man understood the gesture and sat down there with reverence. The old man went inside and a few minutes later returned with 2 wooden bowls, one with water, the other with flour. He sat down beside him, and in silence the two of them ate together. Nothing more was needed, but the village didn't understand. Some whispered from their windows, others approached casually, pretending they were just passing by, but lingered for long minutes. Watching, the children, curious, gathered by the gate, trying to decipher the scene. and even the most skeptical felt something strange in the air, a mix of respect, awe, and shame. Because for many, Bantao was just the old fisherman who spoke little and sold cheap fish. Few knew the story of the boy. Even fewer remembered how often they had mocked him for feeding a stranger, and now that stranger had returned and returned successful, important, wealthy. But there, in front of the old man, he was just a son reuniting with a father of the soul. After the quiet meal, the man asked to see the house. He entered gently, touching the clay walls, observing each detail. He paused in front of the clay stove, looked at the old fishing net hanging there, and lowered his head. Then he said, "You lived with so little and still gave so much. That's something no book teaches." As he left, he pulled a small envelope from his pocket. He handed it to Bantao with both hands. The old man didn't open it. He just held it like someone who understands that the true value isn't inside, but behind the gesture. That afternoon, the whole village seemed to move more slowly. Conversations quieted. Gazes lingered longer. Something had changed. Something had been revealed. And among the few who truly understood the meaning of what had just happened were the elders, those who knew the weight of small gestures, those who understood that fate doesn't always reveal itself in the same time as need. Those who had lived long enough to know that kindness, even done in silence, is never lost. The reunion between Bantao and the man he had once fed in silence was not just a beautiful story. It was a painful reminder for many, because in seeing that man kneeling before the old fisherman, they were forced to face their own silence. They had to remember when they mocked, when they turned away, when they didn't offer even a crumb, despite having more than enough. And for Bantao, that day was not made of words. It was made of healing. It healed the loneliness that had acted inside him, healed the fatigue built up in his bones, healed the feeling that maybe his life had been lived in vain. Because they in that silent reunion, the old fisherman understood that what he had done had not been forgotten, and that even without expecting anything in return, his kindness had planted something eternal in the soul of that boy, in the history of that village, and now in the hearts of those who watched, without fully understanding but feeling, because there are reunions that don't need to be understood. They only need to be felt and remembered, because a single gesture, no matter how small, can travel through time and return like a wave carrying gratitude. Makoma was never the same after that day. The news spread faster than the morning wind. At the well, the neighbors whispered between clenched teeth, trading glances and nudges. The men in the square paused their checkers game. Even the youngest, who barely knew Bantao, began to ask, "Who was that old man who always walked barefoot with his head down?" It wasn't just the expensive car that stirred the village. What truly moved everyone was the scene, that living image no one could forget. A ground man, strong and respected, kneeling before a forgotten old fisherman. It was as if for a moment the world had returned to its rightful place. A good deed done in silence, rewarded in the daylight. The next morning, before the sun had fully cracked the sky, some men arrived at Bantao's house. They didn't knock. Hastily they waited, and when the old man stepped out, they saw to their surprise that the house was different. The bamboo fence had been replaced. The door was new, made of sturdy wood, and inside the smell of fresh plaster still lingered. In the air, the roof, which once creaked in the wind, now gleamed with new tiles, and on the table, for the first time in many years, there was food not counted by the spoonful: flour, rice, oil, soap, and even dried meat, all arranged with care, like someone returning dignity without making a spectacle of it. The man who had once been the boy now came often. He brought supplies but never stayed long. He arrived, greeted the old man with respect, sat for a few minutes on the pork bench, and left quietly. He didn't seek recognition. He didn't accept questions. He only said, "I don't do this out of charity. I do it out of memory." Dot. And that phrase echoed through the alleys of the village. Many tried to learn his name. They wanted to know where he lived, what he did, who he'd married. But he was discreet. He shared little, only enough for people to know that he was doing well, that he had made it, that somehow Bantau's gesture had saved him. One day, he brought the old man a new boat, a strong, wide boat painted blue. The whole village came out to see. It was a beautiful boat shining under the sun like it had been built from hope. Along with the boat came new nets, boots, a life vest. Bantau stood in silence, looking at it all like someone watching a miracle unfold in slow motion. He gave thanks. With a firm handshake, his eyes full of tears, Dot from that day on. No one mocked him again. The cruel laughter stopped. The whispers turned into murmurs of respect, and the old man's house, once overlooked, began to be seen differently. It was no longer just the home of a lonely fisherman. It was the home of someone who had once planted kindness and was now harvesting dignity. Dot. The most beautiful part was that Bantau didn't change. He remained the same, still walked slowly, still wore simple clothes, still greeted with a nod of the head. He didn't grow arrogant. He didn't speak louder. He just seemed lighter, as if finally he carried only the weight of age and no longer the weight of abandonment. And the village quietly began to change, too. A neighbor left a sack of corn by Bantau's door without saying a word. A woman brought a new dishcloth. A child running by stopped to give him a quick, shy hug, but full of affection. Dot. The man's gesture had awakened something long asleep in McMore, something only true kindness can awaken, the collective memory of humanity. Dot. Because no matter how much time passes, there are things only respect can restore. And in that small village where fish was currency and silence was wisdom, people began to believe again that good, even when done in secret, eventually returns. And the most remarkable thing was that the man, despite everything he now owned, never tried to place himself above the old man. On the contrary, he said, "What he did for me can't be measured in money. It's measured in memory." And so the days went by. Bantau's house became a place people visited. Those who wanted to learn humility came there. Those who wanted to hear about gratitude sat for a while on the porch bench. And those who didn't yet understand dignity learned it simply by watching the old man sip his tea in silence. Because there was something in Bantau's presence that taught more than 1,000 speeches. And now, with the returning gesture of the man he once fed, the entire village began to see the old fisherman for what he had always been. A man of integrity, a man of faith, a man who, with little, gave everything. Dot. And finally, even without asking, he was recognized, not with applause, but with the rarest of gifts, the silent respect of an entire village. Time in its silent. Wisdom. Haas, a peculiar way of returning the words once spat out with contempt. In McMahar, where the days move slowly and rumors move faster than the wind, this justice began to show itself in visible ways, especially to those who at some point sowed disdain, thinking life's soil would bear no fruit in return. And Satiko, the boastful merchant who once humiliated Bantau in the market, continued his trade with the same arrogance. His stall remained one of the largest, his words always delivered in a superior tone, still echoed through Wednesday mornings. He had sold plenty in recent months, but there was something in the air slipping from his grasp. Respect. With the return of the wealthy man, the same one Bantau had once fed with fish and flour, the village began to look at people differently. Relationships became more considerate. The elders were listened to with greater attention. And most unsettling for Inseko was seeing his regular customers choosing to stop by the old fisherman's house before stepping into his sleek modern stall. Dot. He pretended not to care, of course. Laughed. Said the villagers were easily moved, that they'd forget soon enough. But deep inside, something gnawed at him. What began as discomfort turned to unease. And when he heard that the man, the same one he'd never greeted, never acknowledged, had bought Bantu a new boat and stocked his home. With food, the merchant swallowed hard. On a hot, stifling Saturday without warning, Eno closed his stall early and went to the old man's house. He wore a white shirt, far too clean to look casual. On his face, the forced smile of someone trying to hide their own discomfort. He clapped. His hands, adjusted his collar, and waited. It was Bantu who answered, as always, with his ancestral calm. "Good morning, Mr. Bantu," he said in a tone he had never used before. "I heard that your friend came back." "The man in the truck?" Bantu nodded, his face unchanged. "Yes, he did come back." There was a pause. Enseo cleared his throat, tried to smile, again, and then, in a lower voice, continued. "So, I was wondering if maybe you could introduce me to him. I have a business proposal. Maybe he'd want to invest in the village market. A man of vision like him could see the potential here." "Right." Bantu stood still for a moment. He looked the merchant in the eyes. There was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet firmness. Then he replied in the same serene voice he used to speak with the river. He didn't come here for business, he came for memory. See, Ko tried to mask his disappointment with a brief chuckle, but his face betrayed him. It was clear he hadn't come out of friendship. He came for gain, for calculation, for regret disguised as interest. But before he could say another word, a voice rose behind him. "Are you the man from the market?" It was him, the man from the truck who had just stepped out after leaving more supplies for the old man. He stood there, arms crossed, watching everything, and Seiko turned quickly and reached out his hand. Yes, that's me. I was hoping to speak with you," he said, trying to maintain an enthusiastic tone. "I've got ideas for expanding the local market. Perhaps we could talk investment." The man looked at the extended hand, then at Enseo's face, and then, without changing his tone, he asked, "Are you the one who told him to go eat bones?" The question hit like a bucket of cold water for a moment. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, dense, filled with memories that couldn't be undone. And Seiko tried to laugh. "Oh, that just market banter. A joke. You know how it is." But the man didn't smile. He lowered his arms, looked at Bantu with respect, then said, "I never asked for anything, never expected anything, and still he gave me everything he could. You had everything and gave only contempt. I don't do business with people like that." He turned and walked toward his car. Eniku stood frozen, hands still suspended, his face burning with shame. There were no scandals, no yelling. But there, before the watchful eyes of the village, he received exactly what he deserved: the silence of humiliation. Later that night, someone saw Ensiko's wife quietly leave a sack of flour at Bantu's door. She didn't knock, didn't say a word, just placed it there and walked away. It was a small gesture, but it carried shame, remorse, maybe even inherited regret. And Bantu, when he saw the sack at dawn, simply picked it up, brought it inside, and placed it with the other provisions without comment, without fanfare, because he knew some people need to lose in order to learn. Others need to see goodness prevail, to understand that mocking humility is mocking their own fate. And that day, Makoma learned another lesson, quiet but unforgettable, that dignity cannot be bought, and that respect, once lost, can only be earned, again with silence and sincere repentance. The sun rose lazily over the Longale River, tinting the waters in shades of copper and orange. As if nature itself knew that this place held more than fish, it held stories. And among all the stories that lived in Makoma, none was more told, more whispered, more repeated by adults and children than that of Bantao, the fisherman who fed a street boy with silence and flour. Over the years, Bantao's house became a landmark, not for how it looked, still simple, made of mud and wood, but for the aura it carried. It was like an altar of kindness, a place where life seemed to walk more truthfully. There, beneath the old cashew tree at the entrance, children would sit on the ground to listen, and the old man, now with even whiter hair and slower steps, would tell his story, not with vanity, not with sorrow. He told it with the serenity of one who knows that memory is a seed, and that each word planted in a child's heart may bloom into kindness. "I didn't give him fish out of pity," he would say, looking off into the distance as if watching the past. "Walk along their riverbanks. I gave it because I recognized hunger." That phrase, spoken so many times, became almost a local proverb repeated by the elders, memorized by the young, etched into the soul of the village like a beautiful scar. The story of Bantao, the boy and his return, became tale, legend, truth, and like every truth that stirs the soul, it crossed generations. The man who had once been the boy continued to visit the old man, not as often as before, for he was now a father of two, and life took him far. But whenever he could, he came. He'd arrive unannounced, park the car in the shade, and sit on the same wooden bench. He didn't say much. Sometimes he'd simply eat a piece of fish like in the old days and share the silence. No words were needed because some friendships don't grow old. Some bonds need no explanation, and some gratitudes never run dry. One day, during one of those visits, the youngest, son of the former merchant, the very one who had once mocked Bantao at the market, stopped before the old man and asked, "Grandpa, how do you recognize a good man?" Bantao thought for a moment, then looked at the river and replied, "A good man is not the one who has much. He's the one who shares what he has, even when it's little. Because goodness doesn't live in the pocket, it lives in the heart." The boy fell silent, and that day he went home carrying something more valuable than coins in his pocket. He returned with the seed of awareness, and like him, others began to draw near. Young people from the village who had once paid no mind to the old fisherman now came to learn from him. They sat by his side, offered help, listened to his stories as if hearing prophecy. Mothers would say, "Go listen to Uncle Bantu. He teaches," without yelling. And the fathers who once hurried past now stopped to shake his hand with respect, because they understood, even if late, that quiet goodness is the most powerful kind. Bantao's name spread beyond Makoma. People from other villages began to come. Some came to listen, others to see if it was true, and they returned with full hearts, carrying not just a story, but a lesson. The humble house with blue windows and a packed dirt floor became a stop for those seeking more than advice. They sought example. Bantao didn't speak of faith as a speech, he lived it. Each gesture, each word, each silence, all testified to a soul that chose goodness, even when no one was watching. And when asked how he had endured so long alone, without reward, without recognition, he would smile gently and say, "Whoever waits for applause for doing good still hasn't understood what kindness is." The village came to accept this as truth. And so Bantao's name became sacred among those who understood the value of simple gestures. Not because of miracles, but because the justice of life, even if delayed, never fails the just. But time, as always, moved on. Bantao's body grew weaker. His legs ached, his eyes burned, but his soul remained firm. Because when the spirit is at peace, even old age has dignity. And then one day, as if saying goodbye without a sound, the old man didn't open his door. The entire village felt it like a cool breeze in the heat of the afternoon. The silence of Bantao's absence filled their hearts. It was the man, now with gray hair and 2 grown sons, who carried the body of the old fisherman to the burial site. He accepted no help, said it was a duty he could not delegate, and there, in front of everyone, with restrained tears and steady hands, he laid a carefully folded fishing net on the grave and a phrase carved in simple wood: "Those who share fish feed destiny." And in that moment, there were no applause, no speeches. Booten, every gaze there was recognition, in every tear a sense of gratitude, and in every heart the certainty that even without ever leaving Makoma, Bantao had touched the world. The old fisherman of Makoma never crossed borders. He never stood on podiums, nor had his name carved in stone. But in the silence of his fishing nets, and in the simple act of sharing a plate of fish with a hungry boy, he did more than many kings. He taught without words the true meaning of humanity. After the burial, the village went into mourning, not a loud mourning of weeping and black clothing. It was a quiet, deep mourning like the Lal River on moonless nights. Banto's absence was felt in every corner, in the porch bench that no longer creaked, in the ember that no longer burned, in the dirt path that seemed more empty than ever. And yet, at the same time his presence multiplied like seeds cast to the wind, his story began to take root in the hearts of those who had listened, lived alongside him, learned from him, and even those who had once mocked him. The humble house, once ignored, became a place of visitation, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. Young and old came to touch the walls, sit on the bench, and hear again from the mouths of others the story they already knew, but longed to feel once more. It was like a prayer in the shape of remembrance. The man, the boy of yesterday, now a father, a husband, an example of dignity and success, made sure Bantao's grave would not become just a name in the earth. He had a small wooden shelter built around it with simple benches nearby. It wasn't a monument. It was a space for listening, a place to tell stories, an altar to the everyday, where what was honored wasn't the man, but the gesture. His children, raised with respect and truth, grew up hearing that story as if inheriting a mission. The eldest at 12 already knew by heart the moment his father had once said, "That fish saved my life," and the youngest, whenever he saw someone living on the street, would tug on his father's hand and ask, "Do you think he's eaten today?" The man's wife, a woman of faith and wisdom, understood from the beginning that the bond between her husband and the old fisherman was more than gratitude. It was destiny, a cycle that began in hunger and ended in honor. And so, even though she had never known Bantao during the hard times, she cared for his grave as if it belonged to family. She cleaned it, brought simple flowers, and sometimes sat there in silence, as if giving thanks for an invisible gift. The village, in its own way, began to change, not dramatically, but genuinely. Some merchants began treating the elders with more respect. Children started listening more to their grandparents, and young people who once only dreamed of leaving began to understand that staying sometimes is also an act of courage. All because of a story that was never written in books, but in glances, in gestures, in silences, and so even after he was gone, Bantao remained present. He was there in the shared meals, in the fish divided, in the words spoken with care. He was there in the eyes of the boy once rescued by the generosity of a stranger, now carrying that legacy with honor and humility. He was there in the phrase, carved with simplicity but carrying the weight of an entire life. Those who share fish feed destiny, and so the story lived on because there are lives that, even if short in distance, are long in impact. There are gestures that, even if simple, mark eternities. And there are men like Bantao who, without ever leaving the village, reached farther than many who crossed the world. All of it for knowing how to share a fish and for never expecting anything in return except the silence of a grateful heart. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our